Paul Newman was leading the pack at Lime Rock Park in Connecticut on a blazing July afternoon in 1983 when he saw something in his rearview mirror that made his blood run cold. Smoke. Black smoke pouring from a car 3 positions back. And then, flames. Orange flames licking up from the engine compartment, spreading fast. Paul had 2 choices: keep racing and win the championship he'd been chasing for 3 years, or abandon everything and help. He made his choice in less than 2 seconds. And what he did next didn't just cost him the race. It cost him a broken hand, second-degree burns, and 3 months of recovery. But it saved a man's life. And it proved that Paul Newman wasn't just a movie star who raced cars for fun. He was a racer who understood that some things matter more than winning. It was July 16, 1983. Lime Rock Park, a small but legendary road course in the hills of Connecticut. Paul Newman was 58 years old and he was living a double life. To the world, he was still Paul Newman, the movie star, the blue-eyed leading man, Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, one of the biggest names in Hollywood. But to the racing community, he was something else. He was a serious driver, a competitor, someone who'd been racing professionally since the late 1960s and had proven himself on tracks across America. Paul had fallen in love with racing while filming a movie called Winning in 1969. He'd learned to drive race cars for the role, and something clicked. The speed, the precision, the focus. The way everything else disappeared when you were behind the wheel at 150 miles per hour. It became more than a hobby. It became a passion. Some people thought it was a midlife crisis, rich movie star buying expensive toys. But Paul didn't care what people thought. He cared about racing, and he was good at it. By 1983, Paul had been racing for 14 years. He'd competed in hundreds of races, won dozens of them, built a reputation as a driver who was fast, clean, and fearless. He wasn't just some celebrity playing at being a racer. He was the real deal. And on that July afternoon at Lime Rock, he was in position to win the Sports Car Club of America National Championship. 3 years he'd been chasing this title. 3 years of training, competing, pushing himself, and today he was leading the race with only 12 laps to go. The race had started at 2 p.m. The temperature was 94 degrees. The track surface was probably a 120. Inside the cars, with full racing suits and helmets, it was hell. But that's racing. You learn to deal with it. Paul was in his blue and white Datsun 280ZX, a car he'd built and modified himself with his racing team. He was in first place. Behind him was his teammate and friend, a driver named Jim Fitzgerald. Third place was a young hotshot from California named Rick Mears. And fourth was a veteran driver named Tony Adamowicz. Lap 38 of 50. Paul came out of turn 7, a tight left-hander that led onto the front straight. He glanced in his rearview mirror, checking his gap to Fitzgerald. That's when he saw it. Tony Adamowicz's car. Something was wrong. Smoke was pouring from the back of the car. Black, thick smoke. And then, as Paul watched, flames appeared. Small at first, just licking out from under the engine cover, but growing, fast. Tony knew something was wrong. Paul could see him trying to steer the car toward the edge of the track, trying to get out of the racing line. But the fire was spreading too fast. The flames were crawling up the back of the car, getting bigger, hotter. Tony was trying to pull off, but the car was still moving at over 100 miles per hour. Paul's spotter, a man named Doug Hayashi, who was watching from the flag station, came over the radio. "Paul, car 4 is on fire. Safety crew is responding." Paul keyed his radio. "How bad?" There was a pause. "Bad. Flames are big. He's trying to stop the car. Sorry." Paul could see it in his mirror. The flames were fully engulfing the back of Tony's car now, and Tony was still inside, still trying to get the car stopped. Paul had a decision to make, and he had about 5 seconds to make it. The racing rules were clear. If there's a fire, if there's an incident, you maintain your position and wait for the safety crew. The corner workers and fire marshals were trained for this. They had fire suits, fire extinguishers, training. That's their job. Paul's job was to keep racing, to keep his car on the track, to win this championship he'd been fighting for. But Paul Newman didn't think about the rules. He thought about Tony Adamowicz sitting in that burning car. He thought about how long it takes for fire to burn through a racing suit. He thought about how fire spreads in a race car when there's fuel involved. And he thought about the fact that the safety crew was probably 30 seconds away. And 30 seconds in a fire is a lifetime. Paul made his choice. He got on the radio. "I'm stopping." His spotter's voice came back immediately. "Paul, negative. Stay on track. Safety crew is responding." Paul ignored him. He stood on the brakes. His car went from 140 miles per hour to 0 in about 4 seconds. The tires screamed. Smoke poured from his brake rotors. He skidded to a stop on the side of the track, maybe 50 yards ahead of Tony's burning car. Paul unbuckled his safety harness, killed his engine, and jumped out. He could see Tony's car now. It was fully engulfed. Flames were shooting 10 feet in the air. The heat was intense even from 50 yards away. And Tony was still inside. Paul could see him thrashing around in the cockpit, trying to get the harness unbuckled, trying to get out. But the smoke was thick. The heat was overwhelming. Tony was in trouble. Paul started running toward the burning car. He still had his helmet on, his racing suit, his gloves. But he didn't have a fire suit. He didn't have an extinguisher. He didn't have any of the equipment the safety crew would have. He just had himself. As he ran, he could hear people screaming. The corner workers were yelling at him to stop. His spotter was screaming on the radio. Other drivers were coming around the track, seeing Paul's abandoned car, seeing the fire, trying to figure out what was happening. Paul reached Tony's car. The heat was incredible, like standing in front of an open blast furnace. The flames were roaring. The paint on the car was bubbling and peeling. The tires were melting, and Tony was still inside, fumbling with his harness latch. Paul didn't hesitate. He reached into the cockpit. The flames were all around him now. He could feel his racing suit starting to heat up. He could smell burning. He grabbed Tony's harness and started pulling. The latch was stuck, jammed, maybe melted by the heat. Paul yanked harder. His hands were burning inside his gloves. The flames were singeing his hair even through his helmet. Finally, the latch gave. The harness released. Paul grabbed Tony under the arms and pulled. Tony came out of the cockpit in a rush, and both men fell backward onto the track, rolling away from the car. Paul dragged Tony about 20 feet from the burning wreck and started checking him. Tony was conscious, coughing. His face was red from the heat, but he was alive. Paul ripped off Tony's helmet. "You okay? Talk to me." Tony was gasping, trying to breathe. Can't breathe." Paul looked at Tony's racing suit. It was scorched in places but not burned through. "You're okay, just breathe. Slow breaths." That's when the safety crew arrived. 3 trucks, firefighters with extinguishers. They swarmed the burning car, shooting foam and chemical retardant. Within 30 seconds, the fire was out. One of the medics ran over to Paul and Tony. "Are you hurt?" Tony shook his head. "I'm okay. I think I'm okay." The medic looked at Paul. "Sir, you need to come with me. Your hands." Paul looked down at his hands. His gloves were smoking. When he pulled them off, his hands were bright red, blistered in places, second-degree burns across his palms and fingers. He also had burns on his forearms where his sleeves had ridden up, and his face was red and blistered where the heat had gotten through his helmet visor. The medic tried to get Paul to lie down. Paul waved him off. "I'm fine. Take care of Tony first." The medic was insistent. "Sir, you need medical attention now." Paul finally let them put him on a stretcher. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he could see the race continuing. The cars that had been behind him were still going. Jim Fitzgerald had inherited the lead. The race was going on without him. Paul had been leading with 12 laps to go. He'd been on track to win the championship. Now he was in an ambulance with burned hands and a face that felt like it was on fire. The ambulance took Paul to a hospital in nearby Salisbury. They treated his burns. Second-degree burns on both hands, both forearms, and parts of his face. The doctor told him he was lucky. Another 10 seconds in that heat, and he would have had third-degree burns. Another 30 seconds, and he might not have made it out at all. Paul asked about Tony. The doctor told him Tony was fine. Minor smoke inhalation, some burns on his hands where he'd been trying to open the harness. But alive. Paul nodded. "Good, that's good." Paul's wife, Joanne Woodward, arrived at the hospital about an hour later. She walked into his room, took one look at his bandaged hands and blistered face, and started crying. "What were you thinking?" Paul tried to smile, but it hurt too much. "I was thinking about getting Tony out of that car." Joanne sat down beside his bed. "You could have died." Paul took her hand with his bandaged one. "I know, but I didn't. And Tony's okay. That's what matters." Paul spent 3 days in the hospital. His hands were wrapped in gauze and bandages. The burns on his face were treated with ointment. The doctors told him no racing for at least 3 months, maybe longer depending on how the burns healed. Paul asked if there would be permanent damage. The doctor said probably not to his face, but his hands might lose some flexibility, some fine motor control. Paul was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Worth it." News of what happened spread fast. Within hours, it was on the evening news. Movie star Paul Newman rescues fellow driver from burning car. The newspapers picked it up. The racing magazines. Everyone wanted to interview Paul. Ask him why he did it, why he abandoned a championship-winning race to help a competitor. Paul refused all interviews. He didn't want to talk about it. It wasn't about publicity. It wasn't about being a hero. It was just what you do. But one reporter did manage to corner him in the hospital lobby as he was leaving. Young guy with a notebook and a camera. "Mr. Newman, why did you do it? You were winning. You had the championship in your hands. Why throw it all away?" Paul looked at him. Those famous blue eyes were tired and bloodshot. His face was still red and peeling. "Because that's what you do. You see someone in trouble, you help. Racing is important. Championships are important, but not as important as a human life." The reporter pressed him. "But you risked your own life. You could have died." Paul shrugged. "So could he. Difference is, I had a choice. Tony didn't." That was all Paul said. He got in his car and drove home. Tony Adamowicz recovered fully. The smoke inhalation cleared up in a few days. His hands healed. He was back racing within a month. He tried to call Paul, to thank him, to tell him he owed him everything. Paul took the call, listened to Tony's thanks, then said, "You don't owe me anything, Tony. You'd have done the same for me." Tony said, "I hope so. I hope I'd have that kind of courage." Paul's voice was quiet. "It's not courage. It's just being human." Paul Newman's hands healed. It took 4 months, not 3. The burns left some scarring, some stiffness in his fingers. His grip strength never fully returned to what it had been, which meant his racing was affected. He couldn't hold the steering wheel quite as firmly, couldn't react quite as quickly, but he kept racing anyway, for another 13 years, until he was 70 years old. He never won that championship he'd been chasing in 1983, but he won plenty of other races, and he never regretted what he did that day at Lime Rock. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered. The moments when legends proved they were human, the acts of courage that happened in split seconds. If you want to hear more stories about the people who shaped an era, the moments the world forgot, and the humanity that defined them, this channel tells those stories. Because these aren't just tales about famous people. They're lessons about who we should be. Years later, in an interview for a racing documentary in 1995, Paul was asked about that day. The interviewer asked if he ever thought about what might have been, if he'd won that championship, if his career would have been different. Paul was 70 years old by then, still sharp, still those blue eyes. He thought about the question for a long time. Then he said, "I think about Tony Adamowicz. I think about his wife and his kids. I think about the fact that he got to go home to them. That's what I think about. The championship? That's just a trophy. Tony's life? That's everything." Tony Adamowicz died in 2016. He was 75 years old. At his funeral, his family asked Paul Newman's son to read a letter. Paul had died in 2008, but he'd written this letter years before and asked that it be saved. The letter was simple. It said, "Tony, you were a hell of a driver and a good man. I'm glad I was there that day. I'm glad we both got to keep racing. I'm glad we both got to keep living. That's all that matters, your friend, Paul." There wasn't a dry eye in that church. Paul Newman raced cars. He made movies. He built a business empire with his Newman's own food company. He raised a family. He lived a full, rich life. But on July 16, 1983, at Lime Rock Park in Connecticut, Paul Newman did something more important than any of that. He saw someone in trouble and he helped. Without thinking about the cost, without thinking about what he'd lose, he just acted. And that action defined him more than any movie role ever could. That's the Paul Newman story that should be told. Not just the movie star with the blue eyes, not just the salad dressing mogul, but the man who abandoned a championship race to pull a burning man from a car. The man who got burned doing it and never complained. The man who said, "That's just what you do." Because in the end, that's the measure of a person. Not what they do when the cameras are rolling, but what they do when someone's life is on the line and they have to choose between winning and being human. Paul Newman chose being human. Every single time. And that's why he was a legend.